Good day, everyone. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Welcome back to our Dr. Class Tuesday seminar webinar format. We're doing a couple of these per semester. Today's panel is entitled Migration on the Rise, the Roles of Work, Violence, and Climate Change. Let me start, as always, first of all, by thanking our crack team of Paula Ibarra and Daniel Mercedes Calderon for their great support. Also introducing and welcoming my two team co-chairs, Alicia Holland to my right and Fran Agopi to my left. The issue of Central American migration and the factors that are driving it is obviously of tremendous importance, both in the United States, America, and Mexico. And today's panel focuses on that issue from several different angles. We are really fortunate to have three outstanding panelists. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, but they're going to speak in a slightly different order. So three speakers. The first is Sarah Bermeo, who is Associate Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at the Sanford School at Duke University. She's also the co-director of the Duke Program on Climate-Related Migration. Her research lies at the intersection of international relations and development with a particular focus on foreign aid, climate change, migration, and global public goods. She's author of Targeted Development, Industrialized Country Strategy in a Globalizing World that was published with Oxford University Press in 2018, as well as a bunch of journal articles. She's a contributor to the Future Development blog at the Brookings Institution and has authored reports to reform foreign aid policies for several governments. Sarah, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming. Abby Córdova is known to many of us here at Dr. Glass. She's associate professor in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame and concurrent faculty at Notre Dame's Political Science Department. She's co-principal investigator of the Notre Dame Violence and Transitional Justice Lab and a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Her research lies at the intersections of criminal violence, militarization, gender-based violence, and their consequences for international migration, particularly as it relates to Central America. She has very quickly also become one of the leading scholars of public opinion and survey research in and on Latin America. She's author of several important journal articles, including publications in World Politics, the Journal of Politics and Comparative Political Studies. And she was recognized, I think, last year as distinguished with a Distinguished Scholar Award by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. She neglected to put this in her bio, but she's also a former visiting scholar here at Dr. Glass in 2016. Welcome back, Abby. Third, we have David Scott FitzGerald, who's Theodore E. Gildred Chair in U.S.-Mexican Relations, also professor of sociology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at the University of California, San Diego. His research analyzes policies regulating migration and asylum in countries of origin, transit, and destination, as well as the experiences of people on the move. Dr. FitzGerald's books are many. They include The Refugee System, a Sociological Approach, which I guess is the most recent, just this year, Polity Press. Refuge Beyond Reach, How Rich Democracies Repel Asylum Seekers, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Third book, Calling the Masses, The Democratic Origins of Racist Immigration Policy in the Americas, was published by Harvard University Press in 2014, and Nation of Immigrants, How Mexico Manages Its Migration. Don't have the year. Several of these books have received major awards. Dr. FitzGerald has also published 7 other co-edited books, including Immigrant California, Understanding the Past, Present, and Future of U.S. Policy, which is published by Stanford University Press in 2021. David, we appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for joining us. Our panel, we're going to go in the order of Córdova, and then FitzGerald, and then Bermeo. The panelists will each go for about 12 minutes, which should leave us hopefully for 30 or 40 minutes of discussion. And we'll take questions both from the in-house audience and also from the remote audience. Quick note to the remote audience, any question on the deep state will automatically be put at the bottom of the pile of questions. A few quick housekeeping items before we start. We have translation into both Spanish and Portuguese. Just if you want to hear any presentation with Spanish or Portuguese, just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Secondly, as always, we'll be recording the lecture today. It'll be available eventually on the Dr. Class YouTube channel. And if you want to get access to the video and can't, just write to us. Third, and finally, if you've got a question for our panelists and you are not at the table, just send your question through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. You can feel free to send your question at any point. You don't have to wait to the end, and we will collect them and feed them, as many of them as possible, to the panel. And we'll close by 1:20. All right. That said, thank all of you for joining us. We start with Abby Córdova.
Many thanks for the invitation to share this space with wonderful panelists. It's certainly great to be back to Dr. Class, and I hope soon it's going to be in person. Many thanks to Steve for moderating and everyone for joining. My presentation today will mainly focus on exploring the role of violence as a driver of international migration to the US, with a particular focus on Northern Central American countries, namely Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. In addition, I will comment on the experiences of migrants with violence in recipient countries, particularly in Mexico in the southern border. So let me get set here. So as the title of today's panel indicates, migration has been on the rise in the past few years. As we explore, this data, we can see that encounters as defined by the U.S. Border Patrol Agency, which includes apprehensions and expulsions at the U.S.-Mexico border, we observe an upward trend after a sharp decline in 2020 when the pandemic hit. In a single month, November of last year, there were about almost a near record high of over 200,000 encounters at the US-Mexico border. At the beginning of the pandemic, migrants from Mexico and Northern Central America together accounted for a higher proportion of encounters at the border. But this, as you can see in this graph, is actually no longer the case. The number of migrants from other countries has increased sharply in the past 2 years, particularly the number of migrants coming from Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, Venezuela, and Colombia. Even though the rise of migration from other countries has changed the composition of the total undocumented migrant population, the number of encounters, namely apprehensions and expulsions of individuals from Northern Central American countries, has also shown an overall increasing trend in the past few years. We observed that the number of encounters with Guatemalans at the border last year was much higher than pre-2019 levels, even though we observed a clear a decline in 2020. Once again, 2020, we see a decline in 2022, and actually in 2020, that was an outlier year due to the pandemic. So, however, we observe also an increasing trend, overall increasing trend in encounters with Guatemala, and this picture is also very similar in Honduras, in which, despite a decline in the number of encounters with Hondurans last year, we see also that the number of encounters in 2022 was also higher than pre-2019 levels. If we look at the data for El Salvador for encounters, we also observe an overall increasing trend in the number of encounters with Salvadorians. In fact, judging from these numbers, the migration rate in El Salvador, or people coming from El Salvador, remain at the highest and pretty constant in 2021 and 2022. At first glance, these trends are somewhat puzzling, I would say, as actually we also see that the overall homicide rates in the, has been actually declining in the past 2 decades, and in general, I mean, in the past years, in the past few years. And if we look specifically to the case of El Salvador, the country actually went from having the highest homicide rate in the world in 2019 to having one of the lowest. The homicide rate dropped from 105.2 in 2015 to 7.8 in 2022. However, as we saw, migration rates in the past 2 years, at least measured by the number of encounters, have been the highest and relatively constant in El Salvador. And actually, this raises the question of whether, I mean, this apparent lack of correlation between homicide rates and migration trends in recent years mean that violence is less influential in migration decisions. And I truly believe, based on all the evidence, that the answer to this question is clearly a solid no. Data from El Salvador actually help us examine in more detail the link between violence and migration decisions in recent years. If we look at data from return migrants are asked about the main reason why they left the country at the re-entry point in El Salvador. And from this data, we observe that the percentage of return migrants citing insecurity as the main reason for migrating was higher in 2020 compared to 2013. Moreover, the research that we are engaged with, along with my colleagues, Diana Orses, John Hiskey, and Mary Malone, we also observe that, women have been actually more likely than men, using different types of data, and you can see one piece here, to cite insecurity as the main reason for migrating, suggesting that the threat of violence has more weight in women's decision to migrate than men's. So taken together, these trends indicate that although lower homicide rates are always obviously good news, to understand the effect of violence on international migration, we need to account for other indicators of violence, including disappearance of people, threats and extortion, and as we are going to see, also state violence. Some might be tempted to think that with El Salvador's adoption of a estado de excepción or a state of emergency, and the subsequent extreme militarization of public security implemented since March of last year, which has actually resulted in the weakening of guns' territorial control, that citizens will feel safer and be less prone to wanting to leave the country in the near future. And in fact, just following the example of El Salvador, Honduras also implemented a state of emergency last December. And so this is the preferred policy, I mean, in general, in Latin America, in many Latin American countries, namely extreme militarization, as we know. In the case of El Salvador, despite the fact that the government enjoys widespread support, a recent survey by the UDOP actually indicates that nearly 50% of the population are skeptical that the state of exception will eradicate guns. Supporting this perception, the State Department issued just yesterday a reconsider traveling warning, indicating that though there has been a significant reduction in gun activity, violent crime remains a concern throughout significant portions of the country. An online survey that I have been conducting in the past 2 weeks for my book project with the support of the Guggenheim Foundation and the Kellogg Institute which is basically just out of the oven. I mean, I was analyzing this data on Sunday, show that fear of experiencing gun violence in El Salvador remains high, and that, not surprisingly, continues to strongly predict citizens' migration intentions in the country. Furthermore, fear of experiencing unjustified or arbitrary arrest at the hands of the police strongly predicts migration intentions, as you can see in this graph. This result highlights the role of state violence and its role particularly in making citizens in general to want to migrate, particularly amidst massive arrests and accusations of human rights violations in the context of a state emergency, such as the one currently implemented in El Salvador, but also in Honduras. So extensive fieldwork research at the Mexico-Guatemala border, and particularly in the city of Tapachula, that I have carried out jointly with Nathan Skiging, a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Notre Dame last year, also documents the terrifying stories of migrants fleeing criminal and state violence from Central America and other countries in the region. We listened to dozens of immigrants' testimonies, and we interviewed them in immigrant shelters, and we also interviewed directors of immigrant shelters. Immigrants told us about the violence that they suffered back home and how that triggered their migration decision, but also that the violence they were actually encountering in the southern border of Mexico at the hands of the National Guard. Patterns that have been widely also documented by human rights organizations advocating for immigrants at the border. And I would like just to share a couple of those testimonies to voice the experiences of migrants who wanted their stories to be known. I would like just to share this first excerpt from an interview that Nathan and I conducted. A migrant from Honduras told us, they showed me here, and then he proceeded to show us the scars on his body. And he said, we never were involved in drug trafficking. Over there are no thieves, no guns, no narco. The narco governs. Law enforcement doesn't do anything. The law can be bought. I said, this isn't life. I better live. And just to continue and show you another testimony, a migrant also from Northern Central America told us, the caravan in which I came was broken up by Mexican security forces. There were about 150 heavily armed agents. We tried to talk to them, but there was no way. Agents of the Mexican security forces threatened and pressured me and some colleagues to jump off the bridge. That's how I broke my foot. Miraculously, I survived. In conclusion, amidst declining homicide rates and states of emergency, migrants continue to flee violence from Northern Central America, explaining in part the increasing migration rates in the past few years. Sadly, migrants flee criminal and state violence and encounter criminal and state violence in recipient countries, often with the support of local populations. Using experimental methods, my research with Nathan Skiging seeks to examine how human rights defenders can promote through media campaigns pro-immigrant attitudes and behaviors in recipient countries in Latin America, particularly Mexico. We are certainly facing a humanitarian crisis at both the US-Mexico border and the southern border of Mexico, which is some sometimes neglected in our conversations. And this crisis, I will say, is definitely largely the result of US immigration policies. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby. Our second speaker will be David FitzGerald. David, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just start my slide presentation there. Can you see my slides?
No.
No. How about now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great, terrific. Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation. And I'd like to just pick up where Abby left off and talk about how the US government has for a very long time now used Mexico as a buffer state to make it much more difficult for asylum seekers from both Central America as well as other countries in Latin America and far beyond, so-called extracontinentales, people coming from the other parts of the world outside the hemisphere, to reach the US in order to be able to ask for asylum. Sorry, there we go. And some of these techniques of buffering are pretty evident if you are reading the newspapers. Others are really happening behind the scenes. And I actually want to start with the air bubble around North America, which is really not very well known at all. And the air bubble refers to the fact that for passengers who are intending to travel to Mexico, even if that's their final destination, coming in from other countries, their information is shared with the US government before they ever even reach North American airspace. There's a shared watch list. There are protocols that have been developed, but I would suggest more or less imposed by the US with regard to screening of passengers coming from so-called special interest countries. If you look at that list of special interest countries, it's overwhelmingly countries in the Middle East, although there are some other nationalities like North Koreans involved as well. And probably what most affects potential asylum seekers is that for decades now, the US government has effectively pressured the Mexican government to put visa restrictions on nationalities with high rates of asylum seeking. What that means in practice is that for people who are coming from many countries in the Middle East and Africa and Asia, it's quite difficult to get a visa to come to Mexico even as a tourist, because there's a presumption that those individuals might try to continue on to the US. And there's a list which has been known, even though it's not always actually 40 nationalities, but that for a long time was the number of nationalities that had these types of restrictions. Also very politically sensitive in Mexico, and therefore not widely publicized, is the fact that there have often been liaison officers from the Department of Homeland Security operating behind the scenes in Mexican airports. This is the kind of thing that the European Union, Australia, and Canada also do at airports abroad. But of course, it raises the specter of foreign intervention and violations of sovereignty, even though it's done with the permission of the host state. But it is a very politically sensitive kind of activity, and therefore typically not publicized. Now, moving to the border region and the Suchiate River that we just saw in Abby's presentation, the US has also attempted to use that general area as a buffer for some time now. For years, it was done quite quietly, but more recently, more publicly, to the point that in 2012, Alan Burson, who was a DHS Assistant Secretary for Policy, said publicly that the Guatemalan border with Chiapas, the Mexican southernmost state of Chiapas, is now the southern border of the US. But despite the fact that we see increased border enforcement activities in that area, we just saw some vivid examples of the human rights abuses associated with that in Abby's presentation. Most Mexican enforcement is not on the borderline itself, and certainly if we go back for the last, say, 40 years, that's not been the case. Most of the enforcement has taken place on transportation routes heading north in what's called in Spanish La Frontera Vertical. So we're talking about rail routes, highways, as well as domestic flights. And so at key choke points where there are transportation hubs, we see various kinds of checkpoints, the widespread use of racial profiling, and various agencies of the Mexican government are trying to figure out who is potentially not a Mexican national and make it more difficult for them to travel north or take the opportunity to extort them. This history, as I said, has been happening for quite some time, going back to the early years of the civil wars in Central America. And in the 1980s, we can see the basic contours of policies that in many ways are still with us today, being developed during the early Reagan administration. So first was to pretty successfully pressure the Mexican government to slap visa restrictions on Central Americans who previously had been able to travel freely, to fly freely into Mexico. It didn't mean that it was impossible to reach Mexico, but it meant that it was more difficult. And all of these measures are simply aimed at making this kind of travel more difficult. Probably less known also is that a lot of visas that were issued to Central Americans, especially those who had crossed the land border in the south of Mexico, had restrictions preventing travel to the northern part of Mexico. Again, with the presumption that people who were in the northern part of the country would be attempting to reach the U.S. The U.S. financed refugee camps in southern Mexico, specifically in Chiapas. There were about 35,000 Guatemalans, a smaller number of Salvadorans who were housed in refugee camps in that state. And also something that we see very much in the current period, but began in the early 80s without any kind of statute or even formally written policy, was for the Mexican government to accept pushbacks sometimes of asylum seekers in border cities like San Diego and Tijuana. There was also a pattern of chain refoulement, where people who were being pushed back from the US were then detained by Mexican authorities and bussed back to Guatemala, from which they were bussed back to El Salvador. Fast forwarding into the 1990s and after the conclusion of the civil wars in Central America, we still see some interesting evidence of the US using Mexico as a buffer for people coming from other parts of the world, and even quietly financing repatriations of third country nationals, and having a specific line item that you can find in the bowels of congressional appropriations for that purpose. Now, for a long time, most of the dirty work, if you will, of deporting the three primary nationalities involved in Central American migration through this area, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and Honduran, has been done by Mexican authorities. In the blue line on top, you can see deportations from Mexico of these nationalities. In the red line, you see deportations from the US. And going into the early part of the Trump administration, we see that in most years, the Mexican government is actually deporting far more of those three nationalities than the US. Beginning in 2007, the US financed Merida initiative really built up the buffering capacity of the Mexican government with all kinds of technical training and the provision of equipment, of software, to try to modernize control systems, to make them interoperable, to make them such that those systems would take all kinds of biometric data about people who were detained, and then share that information with a whole alphabet soup of US government agencies as well, setting up mobile migration control units in these checkpoints that I was referring to along the vertical frontier, various kinds of vehicles, communications equipment like radios. Much of this equipment had multiple uses, and the same equipment that would be used for intercepting migrants would also be used for intercepting various kinds of smuggled products such as drugs. Lots of training has taken place of officials from the Mexican Migration Institute in the US as well. And specifically a lot of training around so-called human trafficking. Why do I say so-called human trafficking? There is such a thing as human trafficking, but I put it in quotation marks because often any kind of people smuggling is brought under the umbrella of trafficking to make more illegitimate traveling without a visa and availing oneself of the use of smuggling services, even when the people being smuggled are not being coerced and really shouldn't fit in that trafficking definition. There are some soft ways that the US government has tried to discourage irregular migration through this corridor. There are radio announcements, there are TV spots, these posters that have as a common thread showing the physical dangers of trying to cross. Of course, the reason why these physical dangers are so dangerous is that the land crossings through urban areas are the ones that have been most built up since the mid-1990s and quite deliberately pushed irregular migrants out into the dangerous wilderness areas. What's characteristic about these advertisements or this publicity propaganda, whatever term you wish to use, is that it's unbranded and it doesn't show that it was paid for by the US government, unlike some similar efforts by the Australian government and Canada and the European Union, which is branded publicity with the same end in some other migration corridors around the world. Now at the US-Mexico border, it's very clear whether one is in Mexico or in the US. There is literally a line, maybe not in the sand, but a line in the concrete, if you will. And one of the things that we've seen in the last few years is an effort to keep people who don't have a US passport or legal permanent residence or a visa to enter, to keep them from even stepping their toe across that line. So in the photograph here from John Moore of Getty Images, that metal line, that sort of metal horizontal line there next to the first set of wheels of the kid's chariot there is the line between Mexico and the US. So Mexico on the right, the US on the left. So US agents or private security guards hired by the US government would put their boots right up against the line to make it impossible for someone to even step their toe across to be able to claim that they were in the US and therefore could avail themselves of all kinds of rights of territorial personhood, including the right not to be refouled, not to be pushed back into the arms of their persecutors. Now, when Andrés Manuel López Obrador was running for office, he came to Tijuana as part of his campaign. He was part of a debate, and he swore that if he was the president of Mexico, that Mexico would no longer be doing the dirty work of migration control for the benefit of its northern neighbor. And in fact, that's not exactly what has happened. And there's been an increasing amount of cooperation between the Mexican government and US government. What really stands out here is that US coercion has been much more blatant with threats to increase tariffs, for example, on Mexican goods, and really using bullhorn public diplomacy rather than the quieter measures behind the scenes that characterized earlier periods. We can see many different kinds of policies involved in this buffering, beginning with metering. This actually goes back to the end of the Obama administration. Metering is where the DHS would only allow a certain number of people per day to approach and file for an asylum application at particular garitas, at particular border checkpoints. The Remain in Mexico program, MPP, the so-called migrant protection protocols, which I think people on the call like Debbie Anker would tell you had nothing to do with the protecting of migrants, and in fact, quite the contrary. This was the program that forced asylum seekers to await a hearing in the US while staying in Mexico. And in effect, that made it very, very difficult, almost impossible for them to have any kind of legal representation in those proceedings, all kinds of communication issues around people knowing when their hearing dates were and being able to cross the border to reach those hearings. Many different barriers. All of that was superseded by Title 42, which of course has been in the news quite a bit, set to expire on May 7th, as I understand. But this is using a 1944 public health law provision that allows the CDC to restrict the entrance of foreigners during the time of pandemic, for example, very clearly used, it turns out from some reporting from the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, really used against the wishes of officials at the CDC for the purpose of controlling asylum seekers, really using public health as a pretext. We also know from the work of reporters that Stephen Miller, the architect of Trump's immigration policies, had hoped to use Title 42 even before the COVID-19 pandemic, was exploring ways to use that provision in a public health law as a pretext to keep out asylum seekers altogether, or certainly those arriving at the southern border. There have been various versions of the transit ban, also very much in the news. And the way that the language that's used to talk about these varies, but they all have as their premise this notion that asylum seekers who have passed through other countries in Central America and Mexico should have availed themselves of the opportunity to apply for asylum in those countries because they are safe to apply for asylum. In practice, we know that that is not the case, and that many asylum seekers face special vulnerabilities once they concentrate in the border cities of northern Mexico in order to wait for a US hearing or to try to cross to the US, and in fact are subject to all kinds of targeted violence from gangs and extortion from public officials and so forth. So we know that in practice, these countries are not safe for many asylum seekers. I look forward to the discussion, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, David. And our third panelist is Sarah Bermeo.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and it's great to follow those two very informative presentations. So I'm just going to dive right in, switching gears a little bit to talk about particularly the role of climate change in determining migration from Central America. And I'll start this by saying that in 2018, I wrote a piece for the Brookings Institution that was titled "Violence Drives Migration from Central America." And you know, it was very much leaning into that, and I think it's very true. It got a lot of attention, a lot of news inquiries, and it became clear to me, though, that by 2019, something different was going on. Not to downplay the role of violence, which I think is actually an overarching factor here, but that people were coming from different areas in the countries, particularly the highlands of Guatemala and the dry corridor in Honduras. That was not what we had been seeing when I initially wrote the 2018 piece. And so I started to look around for ways to try to figure this out. Was there some impact of climate change, and particularly of the droughts that had been experienced throughout the dry corridor in driving this increase in migration that we were seeing at the US southern border? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So there were significant droughts in Central America, particularly in the area called the Dry Corridor, which passes through part of Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and even a little portion of Panama. And very big droughts, 2014, 2016, and then again in 2018. This led to large spikes in crop losses and fairly extreme levels of food insecurity. Back in the 2014-2016 period, there was actually some talk about whether a famine would actually be declared in the Americas for one of possibly the first time ever. And this is part of an ongoing sense that that with climate change, these droughts that we're seeing are going to increase in frequency and intensity and lead to changes in rainfall patterns, particularly during the canicula, this midsummer dry spell that has always, well, I don't know if always, but has existed for at least a very, very long time, and comes kind of at the end of the first planting season and before the end of the first harvest season, and at the beginning of the planting season for the second harvest. So if you get an extended dry spell during that time, it can actually destroy the harvest from the first planting, as well as make it impossible to plant or very difficult to plant seeds for the second harvest. And so it can have a particularly devastating effect. And that is what was, was climate-wise, that was what we were seeing in, subsequent in sequential years here, and then a slight break, and then in 2018 again. But there's a real question of whether this is driving migration. And part of the issue there is that it's very difficult to disentangle the issues of climate change and violence and general economic, desire for a better life when we're looking at these things. And so how could we tell if climate change was actually contributing to what we were seeing? Very fortunate. I have to give huge credit here to a scholar, Stephanie Lutart, who's at UT Austin, who did a Freedom of Information Act request of the US government looking for disaggregated data on people coming to the United States southern border from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, where you can see in the data that they are, which state and which city within the countries they're coming from. And so this allows us to actually then look subnationally at where migrants are coming from those countries, which is different from where a lot of the publicly available data will allow us to look, which is mainly usually at the national level. And so we were very fortunate to be able to have these data, and then to be able to look and see if there were subnational trends that might be being masked or just difficult to pick up when we looked at country level data. And we were able to link these data on where migrants, the city of birth or the state of birth of migrants who show up at the US southern border with department. So a department is think of it like a state, a subnational unit with department level measures of things like agricultural stress, which is an extreme form of close to drought or drought situation within a department, the percentage of the population that was rural, wealth, a wealth index, and then homicide rates, all at that department level, so that we could look subnationally at some of these different drivers of migration. And so here, what you see are data. This is actually similar to data that Abby has shown as well. Total apprehension data from Honduras of people who showed up at the US southern border. We have Freedom of Information Act data from 2012 to 2019. And so what you're seeing there, that red line, is people who arrived at the US southern border and were and came in contact with U.S. Customs and Border Protection as part of a family unit. So you could see that a very large portion of this spike of migrants coming to the U.S. southern border was being driven by people arriving as part of a family unit, as opposed to some of the more traditional migration we might think of, which is a single family member coming over and then potentially sending remittances back. So just right there, it was already kind of interesting to see what was happening. Then we can see where they're coming from. So here with looking at Honduras, we have, these are the 3 states in Honduras that are sending the most migrants to the US southern border. But then I'm going to switch quickly here. Here are the percentages. These percentages, these are the 3 states with the highest percentage of people showing up at the US southern border based on their population in 2012. So at the beginning of the time period that we were studying. And these are striking numbers. Over 7% of the population of some of these states is ending up at the US southern border, traveling as part of a family unit, so with children with them, between 2012 and 2019. And this must be a significant undercount, because it does not count people who are leaving these departments and migrating internally within the country. It does not count people who were leaving and going to a different country besides the United States. And it does not count people who enter the United States without coming in contact with CBP. So these are undercounts, and yet there's still huge numbers of people who are leaving from these states in order to come to the United States with children. Very similar picture with Guatemala, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit. But same thing, family units really driving this increase in migration. States that are showing the highest number of people for out migration. And then here are the percentages again. Here, Huehuetenango showing more than 7% of their population showing up as part of a family unit at the U.S. southern border between 2012 and 2019. So really significant numbers of people from these states are leaving. So then what we're able to do is, as I said, take this analysis and look at subnational data for where people are coming from, and compare that to different potential drivers, including agricultural stress, which is a measure that the FAO puts out that is a fairly close drought or close to drought situation, as well as wealth, violence, and other potential drivers there. And what we find is that when there's an increase in agricultural stress, and this is in Honduras, during the canicula period, so that particular period of that dry spell between the first harvest and the second planting. When you move from no land under agricultural stress to a median level of land under agricultural stress, that's associated with an 155% increase in people from that department showing up at the U.S. southern border the next year. Being located in a rural area is also a huge predictor, or highly correlated with whether or not you are going to show up at the U.S. southern border. So going from being at, say, a department that is at the 10th percentile for the percentage of its population that's rural to the 75th percentile for the percentage of its population that's rural is associated with an increase of 307% of people that are going to be showing up from that department at the U.S. southern border. And then also going back to the really important points that Abby was making in her presentation, we're also able to look at the homicide rate. And we tried to look at that, particularly in the non-rural areas, and show that when the rural ratio was held at a kind of median level, when the homicide rate increased from its 10th to its 75th percentile, also a big increase in the number of people who are showing up at the U.S. southern border from, again, these are department level data, so from those departments. Similar results from Guatemala. Again, an increase in agricultural stress within a department is associated with a significant increase in the number of people showing up with children with them at the U.S. southern border the following year. Same type of results from rural areas. And then when we restrict the analysis to departments outside of the dry corridor, you're also seeing this impact of higher homicide rates at the department level, leading to a higher number of people being apprehended at the border. So I want to link this back to some of the comments that have already been made by the other panelists. When we look at the fact that this trend that we're seeing from Central America is not currently the normal trend that we would see when people are experiencing climate shocks. So most people, the World Bank and other organizations have documented this. Most people who experience a climate shock move within their country. And what we're seeing here are high numbers of people being that are affected by agricultural stress showing up outside of their country, actually a couple countries away at the U.S. southern border. So this actually, really suggests that there's something else. I tell people are leaving their homes because of climate change, but they're leaving their country for other reasons. And some of those reasons involve not having good internal migration pathways to kind of that rural urban migration that we would often see in these situations in other countries is not happening as much here. And that is very likely due to some of the issues that Abby was pointing out in her presentation. The other thing, and I took out the slides on this with just based on time, but the other thing I think is really interesting and unfortunate here is that when you look at U.S. foreign aid policy and their approach to the region, a very, very small percentage of U.S. foreign aid is going to help rural farmers. And much of it is being spent on things like, in more urban areas or on drug trafficking, trying to mitigate those issues, which are super important. But a lot of the migrants who are coming from rural areas, and investment in, kind of a shift of our way of doing foreign aid to invest in some of these areas would really help people who don't actually want to leave their land to have the ability to stay there. But we're not seeing that shift in U.S. foreign aid policy. So I actually think there's some low-hanging fruit to help people here that isn't actually being employed. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you. What a great compliment of panelists. I wish I could claim having put together the panelists, but it was actually Alicia. So to reward Alicia, we're going to give her the first question.
Right, well, thank you, Steve. And it was a collaborative effort. But those were great presentations. I know this is a panel on Central America, but I have to push first one question about the slightly beyond what we're focused on, which is to say, Abby, I mean, it is striking that first graph that you gave, the share of migrants coming from Colombia, Peru, Nicaragua, Cuba, that has really even surpassed those coming from the Northern Triangle. And so, obviously Cuba, Nicaragua, we know the political situation, but I'm curious, how do we explain the Peruvians and Colombians? Does climate, violence, is this just a strong US dollar? So I'm curious about that trend. And I also wanted to connect it to your presentation, David, because I think your idea of a buffer state is really fascinating. And what I want to ask is, has Canada become the new buffer state to prevent migration from South America? And to what extent do you see the tactics used with Mexico being replicated with Panama and the sort of crisis in the Darien Gap at the moment? So one question a little bit beyond, let me dig into, more centrally the sort of dynamics that you're looking at as well. Abby, I was curious for you, we've expanded our sense of the types of violence that matter in terms of driving migration. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about the sort of varieties of, fears and threats that you are trying to map in your project, and how you see the relative weight of things like extortion or violence against women playing out as drivers. David, I'm a little bit curious from your perspective. One of the big changes as well is, the sort of period you covered is just in terms of kind of social media access, WhatsApp groups, providing information. So I'm wondering, have you studied at all the extent to which, migrants have better information about which routes within Mexico they're likely to get stopped at, and also just how understandings of sort of the buffer state role of Mexico, where the choke points are, has changed as it's become easier for migrants to coordinate among each other. Obviously, that also creates increasing risks of manipulation and bad information. So I'm just curious if you've looked at any of those channels. And Sarah, fascinating presentation. I'm curious for you, you sort of emphasize the role of agricultural stress, but what's fascinating about climate change is that it is much more an expectation of a structural change. And so I'm wondering to what extent, farmers who are used to yearly variations in crops and, a particular year of drought have made the jump into saying this is not just, an off year, but this is actually a permanent change in my ability to, subsist and make a living on this land. So I'm not sure if you've done any survey research or if you have any points in your data where you can see sort of the compound effect of multiple years of agricultural stress and to what extent that actually leads to maybe a multiplier on the number of people migrating versus just a sort of annual shock and variance in agricultural stress. So just a couple of questions to get us going, but thank you. Okay, sorry.
If you could each take just a couple minutes on those, if you can. Sorry.
So now take whatever you want to.
Select the ones you want to select, and then we'll get back to more questions.
Yeah, I can get started. So those are truly great questions. The first one related to how do we explain this increasing migration from, people with nationalities that, I mean, it's not very salient, at least, the theme of violence, I mean, doesn't jump immediately, right? I mean, when we think, I mean, particularly about Colombians, and at least, until last year, I mean, Peruvians, I would say that it's very important to understand where is that these immigrants are coming from. And this actually, I mean, we heard a lot in our interviews at the border, and actually Colombians, Peruvians, and people from Haiti, a lot of them were coming from Chile. And so we have to account that as immigration policies really are, very harsh. I mean, and actually that was the case in Chile, that where, like the previous administration really implemented policies that restricted not only immigration, but made it really hard for immigrants already in the country to be there. And so at least, this is another factor that we have to account for. Many of these other countries, right, people were coming directly from their home country, and, violence, I think, I mean, even in the light of a peace agreement in Colombia, still obviously plays a role. However, I think that other factor, where they are coming from. So, for example, with Nathan skiing, we interviewed lots of Haitians who spoke Spanish because they were coming from Chile, right? And so, there are other factors there as to how the immigration policies of other countries in Latin America are also driving international migration. And related to the different forms of violence, right? So certainly non-lethal forms of violence matter in addition to homicide rates. And I will focus on gender-based violence, since, that's the core of my book project. And some of the findings from the book, that is still a project, is that actually we have to understand violence against women in a multi-violence context. And so I'm studying this in the context of El Salvador, looking at how for women living in communities marked by criminal violence, but also by the militarization, in actually the engagement, of the police, military, and crackdowns at the community level, are actually leading to gender-based violence, particularly against women. And so there is all these forms of violence that come together in marginalized communities, to the point that it's not only affecting women on the streets, but actually within their homes. And I actually argue and find evidence that in those areas where all these multiple forms of violence converge, because of the impunity, widespread impunity. I mean, you are not going to call authorities, right, when you see them there also abusing people, and including, engaging in sexual violence against women, that pretty much perpetrators, even at home, so intimate partner violence also increases in those contexts, even if the partners are not related in criminal activities and so on. But basically, there is a lot of impunity that empower perpetrators. And so it's not only about, violence in the streets or violence from gangs and, or state abuse, but it's even domestic violence, intimate partner violence that actually is related to migration intentions. And actually, that's one of the graphs that I didn't show, that I just produced on Sunday, that it does show for women with a higher rate of intimate partner violence, also expressing a higher probability of wanting to leave the country. So thank you.
David.
Yes, so a couple of great questions. In terms of Panama, I can't speak too in any great detail about Panamanian policies right now, but certainly the broader point is that there's this concentric ring of buffer states that's expanding to go far beyond Mexico, really into the entire hemisphere in Latin America. And so Panama, but as well as Colombia, Chile, any country that you can imagine in Latin America is under pressure from US authorities to, for example, criminalize irregular migration, to collaborate with US officers when it comes to cracking down on people smuggling operations. And sometimes these efforts are successful and sometimes they're not. Mexico actually stands out as taking away the criminal penalties for irregular migration, but there are many other examples in Latin America of countries that have made irregular migration a criminal offense based on that kind of pressure. In terms of how people are finding the information, it's a very dynamic situation. We know that the caravans often started with Facebook organizing, but they started out pretty small, where just maybe 200, 300 people would join the caravan initially. And then over time, people who saw the news or people who learned about it through social media, who maybe had been thinking about going to the US but didn't have a particular plan, jumped on that opportunity. WhatsApp is particularly important in sharing all kinds of information. If you look at how, especially national origin groups will very quickly redirect to new destinations, that shows that there's really a massive flow of information. It's a much faster process than the historical way that migrants have shared information about the route. So think about the Haitians in Piedras Negras, for example. That's an example of a really rapid shift of pretty large numbers of people responding to those flows of info. I'll put in the chat in a moment a really excellent book that just came out this year from Alejandra Díaz de León, who is now at the Colmex, which is an ethnography of mostly Central Americans in transit through Mexico, where she accompanied them. And the theoretical question is, how do people get by? The only way that you can get by, unless you have a lot of other resources, is to rely on strangers that you meet along the way. And yet those same strangers might be the ones who are also the source of harm. So how people in real time try to balance those different kinds of risks and get the information that they need in order to succeed in their trajectory is the topic of this book, which is very fresh, really fine-grained detail. So I'll put that in the chat in a moment.
Thanks, David.
Well, great. Thank you for the question. This is actually one of the things, so just to repeat the question, the idea of, what is the difference between why are people migrating now when farmers experience, fluctuations in weather patterns all the time? I actually grew up on a farm, so I'm very, very much in tune to that. I think that there's two potential things, and I can't disentangle them right now. And we actually have some research that's going to be going in the field to help look at this. One is that people probably are, as droughts happen more frequently, farmers are saying to themselves like, oh, this is, and people hear about climate change and they say, okay, I'm actually updating my beliefs about my expected future ability to feed my family on this land. And so I do think there is some of that. Theoretically, that's extremely interesting because it can kind of tie into the literature on the links between migration and income levels within a country, and actually, suggest that they might not work the same way when incomes are decreasing as what a lot of the literature has found when incomes are increasing, which I think, so from a theoretical standpoint, very interesting. But another thing that I think is happening, and again, we can't exactly tease this out right now, but when farmers lose a crop, they have to often go into dis savings or go into their assets in order to afford to get seeds and to do other things to plant their crops again next year. And I think one of the things that we can see is that when migration costs money, investing in your farm costs money, and there's only so much money. And so I think we're running into a situation now where people are facing an that they say we can afford to migrate today, or we can afford to invest in our farms. But if we invest in our farms, we might not be able to migrate tomorrow. And so I think we really could be at somewhat of a tipping point situation. I'm working with some agronomists in Central America who have been who have been working on, farm innovations with groups, and we're going to be going out and doing some surveys, both of the farmers that got the interventions and also ones that did not, to try to ascertain a bunch of different things, only one of which is migration intentions. Historically, and one of the reasons I was so glad to get the data that we did, it's really difficult to ask people in surveys about their migration intentions and have something like climate change come up, because they'll often say, well, I lost my job, right? Well, then you have to kind of dig down a little bit more. Why did you lose your job? Well, you lived in a farm, you worked on a farm. Okay, well, where was the farm? Did it experience agricultural stress? And the surveys so far designed really haven't done that. And so it's going to require a little bit more survey work, I think, with some more detailed questions to really be able to answer that. But my guess is that there's some of both going on. People are updating and saying, we can't keep living here. It's not a sustainable situation, but also that people are running out of money after successive crop failures and saying, if we want to migrate, we have to do it now while we can still afford to do so.
Thanks. Reed.
Thank you so much for all these just wonderful discussions. I have a question that came to me as I was listening to Sarah's presentation, but I think it has relevance for all three of you, which is, Sarah, you were showing us that people are starting to migrate for reasons that are different than perhaps we have thought of in the past, and to some degree, Abby, you do as well. My question stems from the fact that our systems for receiving migrants are very much based on an idea, like thinking of like asylum procedures and things like this, that these are based on protecting people from very specific forms of harm and persecution that look different from the types of harm and persecution that people are dealing with now and that are encouraging them to migrate for your research. And so the question I have for all three of you is whether or not the US and Mexican legal systems and security systems are responding differently to these migrants who are now coming for reasons that are a little bit different than what those legal structures were originally designed to handle. So that's just the question.
Good. Whoever wants to lead off.
I'm happy to take a stab at that. In some ways, there's actually a long precedent in the US for having some kind of special legal protection for people who are facing natural disasters anyway. And these tend to be for acute natural disasters, so say an earthquake or flooding or something like that. But going back into the early 1950s, you see lots of examples of that. The same legislation that provided slots for Europeans displaced by World War II or people coming from communist countries also had provisions that were used for people who had been flooded out in the Netherlands or subject to an earthquake in Greece. There was legislation proposed and passed by Kennedy back in the 50s for his constituents in Massachusetts, whose families in the Azores had been affected by a large earthquake there, to bring in, I think, 2,000 Azoreans. You see it in the 1965 reforms to the Immigration and Nationality Act, a recurring provision for people who were fleeing those kinds of disasters. And then the whole logic of TPS, the temporary protection, is that one of the grounds for providing protection is in the wake of some kind of natural disaster, such as earthquakes in El Salvador. So, we have some beginnings already in our law that have been around for a long time. What we don't have is provisions for these kinds of more chronic agricultural stresses, which have become worsened by systemic climate change.
Anyone else want to?
I mean,
I'm Steve Levitsky Stanton. Anyone else want to respond?
I'll say I do think that there is a growing sense among climate activists at the international level that this problem isn't going away. This idea of people moving across borders for climate-related reasons, whether it's islands in the South Pacific, or people migrating from Africa up into Europe, or people migrating from Central America into the United States, that we can either handle it or we cannot handle it, but it's going to happen either way. And so there is some push for to think about whether climate migrants should have their own special classification internationally. It's unlikely, quite frankly, right? So, I mean, there are people who are talking about this, and international legal experts, and there is sometimes a discussion of it around climate-related, negotiations at the international level, but not really a lot of progress is being made, which is potentially, problematic, because we expect people to be, all projections expect climate-related migration to be increasing over the next, 20, 30, 50 years. And we don't really have, as you pointed out, an architecture to deal with that.
Do you want to jump in, Abby? You don't have to.
Yeah, I just want to say that, at least for me, it's always troublesome, the different categories for which people, are eligible to apply, right, for asylum and so on, or consider for TPS, because in general, regardless of the cause, certainly most people, either economic security, physical security, climate change, and you name it, this is forced migration, right? And most immigrants are really, in a situation of life or death. And I think there are really larger questions, that need to be addressed, not only within the US, but, internationally, as to who has credible reasons, right, for applying to asylum.
I have Caitlin next.
Thanks, you all. This was so interesting, and I really enjoyed thinking about the overlap between presentations. So my question is, in thinking about what you presented today, it seems like we might think that each topic that you all study would have a different effect on the desire to migrate versus the ability to migrate. So we could think that, like, for each of you, right? So for violence, that perhaps increasing violence makes people want to migrate more, but less capable of doing so. We might think the same in terms of, climate change. And we might think so too, if we're thinking about Mexico as this buffer zone where, it's taken away perhaps Mexico as a place that your family could go. So perhaps you feel you need to go further, but it makes you less capable of doing so because of all of the policies that you talked about. And so I'm wondering to what extent we should really study the intent to migrate or desire to migrate separately from the ability to do so, and what we gain by studying those things separately versus together.
Yeah, just a quick thought, great question. So one of the things that we did a few years ago was to survey people in 3 different parts of Mexico that were strategically selected for their characteristics, and to survey all the adults there and in the US about their intention to migrate or their migration histories. And one of the things that came out of that is that, particularly when we were talking to people who were living in the South, say Oaxaca, that the fact of so much violence in Mexico was what made people want to leave, but they were afraid of crossing the northern border zone, where the violence is much, much worse than it is in a state like Oaxaca. And so it's almost a perfect illustration of that, short-term interest in thinking, it would be good to be able to reach a place where I could live in security with my family, but I know that the act of doing it is going to expose me to far greater risks than if I just stayed in my home state. So that's what we found in that particular study, which would be a very different dynamic from people who live along the northern border in large urban areas, who have economic resources, who are able to get a US visa, and maybe will move to San Diego and go back and forth as cross-border, more or less elite commuters. They're in a very different kind of position. So understanding the geographies within Mexico and just how different those effects are is really important.
Thanks. Yes, thanks for the question. Yeah, so actually this is a topic that Jonathan Hiskey, Professor Hiskey at Vanderbilt is studying, who is in this call. I mean, to what extent people saying, yes, I want to live or intend to live actually translates into taking measures and to live. And I think that's consequential. At least from my point of view, you know, thinking again about, you know, the gender dimension of all of this. So we know that women in general are less likely to actually migrate. But however, what we are finding also in our research is that once they face the threat of violence, actually somehow they decide to do so, right? Regardless of all the social norms about, you know, how women should behave, or, you know, maybe taking care of the children, or actually taking the children, you know, with her. And so I think this is certainly consequential because it relates, I mean, also to the resources, right? The not being able to migrate, even if you want to, because of lack of resources or societal norms, actually can also put you even a higher risk in some of these countries because of the lack of internal protection to these people, right? So I think that even not taking measures to actually live, we can see it in a way as a security threat to that person, right? And again, in the case of women, violence is a trigger of migration that has a lot of weight in their decision.
Yeah, I would, I'd say, I mean, this question gets to the heart of not just thinking about Central America, but about how I think the literature is starting to think about migration in general, and really thinking about both the capability to both migrate as well as the capability to stay. And that really, you know, what we're seeing kind of, if we look globally, if we zoom out from Latin America, I mean, in places in Africa, people who may want to migrate but lack the resources, literally the financial resources to do so, right? And so become trapped populations. Central America, I mean, even though these are relatively poor countries, they're significantly better off on average than people in Africa, in many African countries are. And so they do have, and they are located close to the United States. And so they do have an option for migrating. And I really think that, you know, to understand the pathways of migration that we're going to see in the future, it's going to require understanding both of those things, both those, you know, both the desires to leave, but also where people have the resources, whether those are financial or otherwise, to do so, and having policies that reflect both aspects of that, and having theories that reflect both aspects of that, which I think is something the literature is playing catch up with right now.
So we're running out of time, but I have a couple of questions that came in remotely that I think can be answered pretty quickly. One of them was how much the sender government, the nature of the sender government, outside of extreme authoritarian cases, has to do with spikes in migration flows, and specifically the question asked whether the ascent to power of Gustavo Petro in Colombia is linked to the rise in migration from Colombia. Apparently, there are reports that 500,000 people left post Petro. It sounds a little high, but that was the question. And the other question asks Sarah specifically to expand a little bit on her brilliant statement towards the end that people leave their homes because of climate change, but they leave their countries for security and other reasons. If you could just say a little bit more about that.
Sure, I can start with that one. So what we see, so if you look at countries like, say, Bangladesh is experiencing a large amount of high levels of climate impacts, high levels of climate migration, but it's almost all internal climate migration. And that is because there are not great, honestly, because it's leading to the growth of megacities and other unfortunate situations, but people see an ability to migrate internally. Throughout history, we've seen, people in agricultural areas migrate to the nearest urban areas when they've decided to migrate, again, usually within their own country. That's just a normal part of the development pathway for a lot of countries. And that's not what we're seeing necessarily here. We're seeing people leaving countries, and that suggests that there's something specific to those other factors within these countries that is driving people to say, okay, I'm leaving my farm, but I'm not just leaving my farm, I'm leaving my country too. And so that I think is, is something different. And I'll let others talk about, answer to the other questions.
Are people fleeing the Petro government in Colombia?
Yeah, well, I, don't have a solid answer to that, but other to say that, at least from my point of view, is very early to have a definite answer to that. And I will say that, I mean, in countries in Latin America, I mean, we have seen, right, that clearly when you don't agree also with the government in power, you could have a great incentive to leave. But of course, we will have to see the profiles of those people leaving. We can think about, I mean, starting with Cuba and so on, who left, right? And whether the profile of the migrants leaving is similar to the ones that we are talking about. And I don't have that information now, but that's a very interesting trend that I think we need to investigate more.
Okay, unfortunately, I need to close, but please join me in thanking Abby Córdova and Sarah Bermeo and David Scott FitzGerald.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, everyone. So good to see you.
Come back soon, Abby.
New and old friends.